Today's discussion pertains to dealing damage in Pathfinder, and we begin with damage rolls. When you deal damage, obviously you are reducing your enemy's health. So it stands to reason that before we can discuss how to relieve your enemies of their wellness, we begin by briefly defining the way it is measured. HP, or hit points, is a measure of the amount of harm you can endure. From there, we can define damage as the number that measures the reduction of HP. Sometimes damage will be given to you as a fixed amount, but more often than not, you will find that you will need to roll for damage. You roll for damage by following these steps. So, firstly, you roll damage dice. Then you apply modifiers, bonuses, and penalties. So everything is exactly the same as we have done with checks and with attack rolls. You then determine damage type, apply immunities, weaknesses, and resistances, and then if there is any number remaining, you reduce HP by that amount. Now let's go over these steps one at a time. Roll damage dice. So to do this, you essentially need to know two things. Firstly, you need to know the type of dice to use, and then you need to know how many of the dice you need. For example, casting Fireball would require 6d6, whereas striking with a longsword is 1d8. When you see this notation, by the way, the first number always means the number of dice, whereas the second one refers to the type of dice you are using. So d6 means six-sided die. So to roll for damage correctly, you need to know the kind of die your weapon or your spell requires. In case of weapons, if you look them up in the table, you will see that each weapon lists the damage die used for its damage roll. Standard weapons deal 1 die of damage. You will see that there is always 1 in front of D, but that can change. Things like potency runes and certain spells can increase the number of damage dice used. Keep in mind that this changes the number of dice, not their size. And speaking of sizes, in Pathfinder, size matters. You must use the correct damage die for your weapon. So D4 is the smallest. In order of increasing sizes, D6 is the next size up, D8, D10, and then D12. So these are the 5 damage dice listed in order of increasing sizes. Sometimes you might encounter an effect that asks you to increase the size of your weapon damage dice. You can do that, but you must follow these rules. To increase die size, use the next larger die instead of your normal one. So if you normally use D6, you would use D8. If you normally use D8, you would use D10, and so on and so forth. Secondly, you cannot increase die size more than once. So even if 2 separate effects are telling you to increase the die size, once you have increased it once, that is it. You can't increase it more. And lastly, you cannot increase the size above D12. So D12 is the maximum. So you figured out which dice to use, you got your number. What do you do next? Well, next you determine modifiers, bonuses, and penalties. So the similar, I should say, formula that we have used before. There is one arising complexity relating to the use of attribute modifiers. You won't always be applying it, so knowing when and how it applies does warrant some discussion. So, if you are attacking with a melee weapon, thrown weapon, or making an unarmed attack, you will add full strength modifier to your damage roll. So the modifier is strength, and you apply the full amount there. On the other hand, if you're making a ranged attack, if you're attacking with a spell, or you're throwing an item of some sort, you do not add strength modifier to your damage roll. So instead, your formula then becomes this. And there is one more situation, and that's when you are attacking with a ranged weapon that has a propulsive trait. In that case, you add a half of a strength modifier to your damage roll. So the formula then becomes this one here. Then we are at step 3, determine damage type. So Pathfinder has many types and categories of damage. For example, energy damage often comes from spells or magical effects. Physical damage comes from physical attacks, and so on and so on. You have precision damage, spirit damage, poison. For example, if you're casting a fire spell, you are administering energy damage to your enemy. More specifically, you're doing fire damage. They might respond in kind by grazing you with some physical damage, in this case, slashing or bludgeoning, depending on how sharp that thing is. And while they're doing that, your companion may use this opportunity to relieve them of one of their kidneys. So, creature's vulnerable spot sometimes grants precision damage. So, these are just a couple of damage types. We will discuss damage types in more detail in the next lecture. In step 4, you apply immunities, weaknesses, and resistances based on the damage type you are administering. So there is more to this game than just rolling dice and adding numbers. Knowing when, where, and how to strike your enemy can be crucial. You would not, say, cast a fire spell if you know that excessive drinking gave your enemy fire resistance. What you do is you target their failing liver instead. The key is to choose your attacks wisely. Immunities, weaknesses, and resistances must be applied in specified order. So immunities are always first, weaknesses second, and resistances third. And lastly, after applying all of this, if there is any damage left, you reduce HP amount by that number. For the rest of the lecture, we discuss a few more rules surrounding damage. If the situation calls for damage to be doubled, there are 2 ways to do that. There are 2 ways to double the damage. The standard way is to roll damage once and then you double the entire thing. Alternatively, if your damage roll is exceptionally low, you've had bad luck the entire session, and your GM is the sympathetic type, like mine is, instead of doubling the small number, that whatever it is that you've rolled, they may let you roll again and then add your first result to the second and then add both numbers to the 2 times the total modifier. According to the rulebook, this usually works best for single target attacks or spells at low levels when you have a small number of damage dice to roll. To halve the damage, you go through exactly the same process as before, exactly the same thing, but you halve the damage amount at the end. And don't forget, in Pathfinder, we always round down unless the rule says otherwise. You might occasionally find yourself in a situation where you need to find someone without killing them. Weapons and spells with non-lethal trait can be particularly effective in that situation. Now, it is possible to make lethal attacks non-lethal. In that case, you need to take -2 circumstance penalty when making the attack. This penalty does make sense when you think about it. When you look at lethal weapons and the way they are made and the way they are designed, they're not exactly designed for capturing someone alive. So this penalty that you're getting is reflective of the challenge of capturing someone alive with a weapon that's designed to kill. The same holds true for the opposite as well. If you want to make non-lethal attack lethal, you take the same penalty, so -2 circumstance penalty to your attack roll. Your fist, for example, is normally a non-lethal weapon, but if for whatever reason you want to administer some lethal fisting, you can do so by applying -2 circumstance penalty to your attack roll. And on that note, we will wrap up for today. Next lecture covers immunities, weaknesses, and resistances in a bit more detail, as well as different damage types.